here we have the 20 recommendations of the group. You will notice, the eagle-eyed amongst you, that they're actually numbered up to 21. This has been caught in the manuscript, and I've been in correspondence with BMJ Evidence-Based Medicine, who have corrected this. Essentially, there was an extra bullet point for R3, which actually was a generic point applied to 4 of the subsequent recommendations. So when you access the version of the paper that's final and approved, there will be the nice tidy 20 recommendations. So it's not a decalogue, it's 2 decalogues in the sense of the commandments for rapid qualitative evidence syntheses. So what I'm going to do for the next few minutes is to go through these recommendations, not looking all the time at the supporting evidence that's there in the supplementary appendix, but really in a form of memoing about these, some useful pointers for you or some useful observations. So that hence the recommendations are on the left-hand side of these slides, and then the memoing is on the right-hand side here with these pseudo post-its. So we recognize, particularly in a context of qualitative synthesis, particularly given the importance of stakeholders and what we call within the series knowledge users, that this is not one of the areas that we would encourage to be omitted. It may have to be abbreviated and accelerated, as with the rest of the review, but certainly we have recognized that the involvement of knowledge users actually becomes more critical in a resource-constrained context, because it's more important to answer the exact question that is needed and get rid of any risk of expending resources inefficiently answering less important questions. And in that context, I'd point you to the generic paper in the series, a really helpful contribution led by Garrity Trico and colleagues, including Maureen Smith from Canada, on the involvement of all sorts of knowledge users, patient, public partners, providers, and policymakers. The second recommendation revolves around the use of templates, both in the use of the protocol and, as you'll subsequently see, at subsequent stages of the review. For those of you who haven't already encountered it, there is an extremely useful document produced by the former Cochrane EPOC group that is a QES protocol and review template. So this is a document that prompts you for the elements of a QES protocol and which can then be updated as you write your review. And this was a key resource for our own team, led by Catherine Houghton, when we did the first ever rapid Cochrane QES. Having a template like that with clear guidance on what should be included in each section was really important. So I recommend that resource to you. The next 2 recommendations relate to the setting of the eligibility criteria. There are no special question formulations specifically for rapid or resource-constrained qualitative evidence syntheses. The thing to bear in mind, though, is that because formulations like SPICE and Perspective require you to identify the perspectives of interest, that you may face some difficult choices on which perspectives you're going to favour. So it's recognised that it's unlikely that you would be able to include myriads or multiple perspectives within a rapid QES. So you will have to typically focus on the primary group of interest. And then the 4th one relates to the use of indirect evidence. Now, this may seem a strange concept to those of you used to, for example, pharmaceutical reviews where a drug is either included or excluded. Many of the phenomenon that we deal with in qualitative research may have transferable mechanisms or principles that mean that evidence that is not an exact match can still be useful. And that was exemplified in the Cochrane Rapid QES by entertaining such conditions as SARS and MERS and tuberculosis and flu-like illnesses as a way of understanding how we can treat with barrier control of COVID. And the reason for that I've already mentioned. There wasn't enough qualitative evidence on COVID, so we had to, if you like, extrapolate from related conditions. And this is more common than we might expect. I've added a further instance from our own experience of doing work for the WHO, where they were interested in recommendations for infant feeding for Zika virus, very poorly covered. We had half a dozen studies. And so we broadened that out to guidance for other conditions that involve swallowing difficulties. And we included such things as cerebral palsy. And by doing that, we were able to broaden the recommendations with a further 6 studies. Moving on, still within the context of setting eligibility criteria, if we're faced with hard choices, then we may want to privilege richer qualitative accounts. And in that connection, the Cochrane and Campbell Handbook of QES will be notable by being the first detailed guidance on issues of sampling and richness. Currently, to accompany that chapter, there is a manuscript under submission by Heather Ames and colleagues on a proposed richness scale, and that's going through the Cochrane New Cochrane Journal process at the moment. And we also face decisions about what we're going to include as qualitative data. So are we going to include only accounts of qualitative research? Are we going to include sources of qualitative data, not necessarily framed within a research study? Are we going to include data from quantitative studies where qualitative fields have been opened up to users? And so these considerations of what we're going to include as data and how rich data needs to be in order to be included in the study are very important. And the other thing for us to think about, as with most rapid reviews, a starting point is existing reviews. And what we've been doing is working on the role of overviews of QES. There are a couple of methods that have already been tried of this. We've tried both those methods ourselves in reviews for WHO. And again, this will be further covered in the forthcoming Cochrane Campbell Handbook. In terms of searching, we endorse the recommendations of the Rapid Reviews Group about the involvement of an information specialist. The scale of that involvement may be limited by resource constraints, but at the very least, they should be able to advise on the main search strategy and to provide some generic advice on the strategy to be used and the sources. But obviously, the optimal approach would be to involve them in conducting the searches and documentation, and of course then recognizing them in the authorship. The idea of searching a limited number of databases is still an area that people approach with caution because of the systematic review background, but there is empirical evidence to suggest that as long as our search on a core database is very well designed, it's very sensitive for that database, that we don't need to have dozens of databases in order to provide good coverage. So I used to endorse Medline as the single preferred source because it does reach figures into the late 80% of included studies, but empirical evidence suggests actually that Scopus is even better in terms of coverage of included studies. So Scopus would be a good source in terms of its coverage, but with the health caution here that because it's a federated search engine, so a search engine made of multiple search engines, it loses some of the functionality that PubMed records have when they are in the PubMed system. So you may well find yourself preferring the enhanced search facilities of Medline, particularly if you can access Embase separately as well. But what we're recommending there is that in terms of coverage, rather than functionality, Scopus is a good starting point for qualitative research. So moving on, the importance of the peer review of search strategies, and I'm just pointing you here to the guidance that's available on how to peer review an electronic search strategy. And rather than lump together grey literature, as we often do with systematic reviews, to think specifically about the type of grey literature that's going to make a particular contribution. And I've also put here one of the useful resources in terms of citation chasing. We suggest that citation chaining may be particularly useful in contexts where the terminology and the subject area is diffuse. Moving on, study selection. We can save time by using pre-prepared, pre-tested templates. Have illustrated there how we use Excel. We design our drop-down menus to speed up the process of selection, and it allows filtering and having different views through the data if we're going to move on to sampling. It can also be used to code the records at the same time as selecting them. So instead of just include or exclude, we could have categories that help us to place records within particular samples. Recommendation 12 is to design our quality assurance procedures around where the threat most likely lies. So if we're worried about overthrowing out of articles, then we design a quality assurance strategy specifically for that. If we're worried about wrongful inclusion, then again we can design our strategy for that circumstance. So not having a standard approach, but essentially identifying where the risk lies. And this fits in with the more generic rapid guidance. Point 13 relates to how we might mobilize our resources within that. So in some cases, it will be about using additional reviewers. In some cases, it will be using a percentage of inclusions. We've used the same threshold of 20% that the Rapid Reviews group endorsed in their generic guidance. Data extraction, we see limited evidence for requiring double reviewers. In this particular case, we're endorsing use of a single reviewer. We may have to limit the number of items that we extract, and it can be particularly helpful if we have some standard study characteristics that we will extract for every rapid QES, and then we look at augmenting from that generic template. For those of you who are interested in alternatives to data extraction, so recognizing that some people will not physically extract data, but will code data, then Catherine Houghton and colleagues have written an excellent article on using NVivo for that part of the process. Assessment of methodological limitations. Those of you familiar with the Cochrane guidance will know that we don't currently endorse any particular tool for assessment of methodological limitations. However, work is underway, led by Heather Munthe-Kass. In fact, I think there is a seminar tomorrow by Cochrane Ireland that is on this topic, a new approach to quality assessment. We envisage that this approach, which the schema is shown in the top corner there, may well be adaptable to rapid approaches. but it has to be said that the full version has been piloted and may have time implications. So there's still work to be done there on taking this new approach to quality assessment and rapidizing it, if there is such a verb. Again, we believe that a single reviewer will be sufficient in the context of a rapid qualitative evidence synthesis, but with a second reviewer perhaps looking at a sample of statements or looking at the underpinning evidence for particular critical statements. Approaching the end of the 20 recommendations. So recommendation 17, there are certain methods that have been consistently reported as being quicker than others. Thematic synthesis is the basic building block of qualitative evidence synthesis, but you can achieve time efficiencies if you can identify an existing framework. So framework synthesis can be even quicker than thematic synthesis. What we would suggest in practical terms is that you set a time limit, perhaps an hour or 2 hours, to identify an appropriate framework. And if you're unable to find one within that sort of time period, that you go ahead with the plan to use thematic synthesis. So framework synthesis only achieves its efficiencies if you can locate a framework fairly speedily. Obviously, we encourage everyone to consider whether a conceptual model or theory or framework is going to be an option, not just as a way of organizing and coding and interpreting the findings, but also because it may be amenable to the view of the commissioner of the review as a way of presenting findings. So it may actually help you to mobilize and organize your data. So a framework that doesn't carry any bags and baggage that is acceptable to a commissioner can actually speed up the acceptance of the findings as well as the technical process. In terms of selecting methods of synthesis, just refer more widely to the guidance that is available on choosing a synthesis method. The RETREAT acronym here, and what we attempted to do in this earlier paper was to map different methods against these 7 criteria. And so that's where our recommendations for thematic and framework synthesis come in, factoring in such things as timescale, resources, and expertise. But there are a lot of synthesis methods to choose from. Here's a listing of allegedly 35 qualitative synthesis methods. So the good news is that the Cochrane group is mainly promoting 3 main types: framework and thematic for those being used for practical recommendations, and metaethnography where conceptual understanding is more important. So the Campbell set is slightly larger than that. It extends as far as meta-aggregation as well. But essentially, these are regarded as being the most amenable to the sorts of approaches that we're endorsing in this paper. Has to be said that metaethnography is not commonly used in a rapid context, even where rapid metaethnographies exist, which we reviewed for this guidance. It seems that they used more extensive resources than the labeling of the paper implied. For those of you interested in a bit more in the methods of individual synthesis, just to flag up that in a previous series run by the Cochrane Qualitative Group, there are webinars on these 3 methods. So I'm not going to go into much detail of these, and also these constitute chapters in the forthcoming Cochrane Handbook of Qualitative Synthesis. We're nearly to the end. Thank you for bearing with me through these 20 recommendations. Obviously, the primary focus for such rapid or resource-constrained reviews is for supporting decision making. That's a very strong motivation for doing this quickly. And so we open up the possibility of reusing existing grade circle assessments if the findings are relevant and of demonstrable high quality. And this is where the work on a standard tool for methodological limitations is most important. And one way, of course, of speeding up the process is to use available tools. So just to flag up that if you are involved in producing grade circle type recommendations, that there is a free software online platform run by the Grade Circle core group called ISOC. And our final recommendation is very much linked to that in order to achieve this process quickly, we need to use review management software or qualitative analysis management software to streamline the process. And this again ties in with the wider guidance of excellent article from within this Rapid Reviews series on the use of supportive software. Now, within qualitative research, we stopped short of making recommendations specifically around AI. And that is because we're still experimenting with that. Certainly, though, we have every reason to believe that in future classifiers will be a possible approach, but we didn't feel confident enough to have it in this particular edition of the guidance. So just a final exhortation that a rapid or resource-constrained QES is not a qualitative evidence synthesis done badly, and it's not even a qualitative evidence synthesis done cheaply. Hopefully it's done cost-effectively. And also that just stripping down to the skeletons of the recommendations mustn't allow us to overlook some of the other things that we need to have in place. And so here we've supported some of the things that you would look for from our reading of the literature. So the importance of the core team, their communication, documentation of deviations from conventional methods, etc. So in summary then, the take-home message is, what we're trying to do is achieve a balance between rigor and speed, but integrity is key here, that we want to maintain constant communication, not only within our review team so that we work efficiently, but also with our evidence or knowledge users. We need to ensure that our search strategy is well targeted. So that's why 4 of our recommendations are around the eligibility criteria. The choice of synthesis methods will be a critical decision, which is why we endorse the retreat criteria. Sampling is opened up as a possibility to offer additional flexibility, particularly when presented with multiple articles. And although we tend to think of narrowing down and making smaller, there will be circumstances where resource-constrained reviews require us to extend our coverage to indirect evidence so that we can provide the knowledge users with an answer. So the final word, we would like to just really emphasize how documentation is absolutely key to a rapid QES, that it should describe its limitations and the implications of those limitations for our confidence in the evidence. And so in a way, it should do this even more thoroughly than a regular QES to build up consumer confidence in the product. And the other thing that we haven't really spent much time discussing today, but which is a real important theme throughout the forthcoming Cochrane handbook, is the importance of reflexivity of the review team. And this again becomes important under the context of constrained resources. So in conclusion, if a QES methodology is to remain credible, we're not to be excused of quick and dirty approaches, then we must apply these rapid approaches always with insight and to document them with circumspection.